I will talk about capital globalization, the 21st century crisis, and Latin America backwardness. What's next? I start off by saying that the dominant economic model imposed in the late 1970s turned dysfunctional for the capitalist accumulation. The deregulation and globalization, the main pillars of neoliberalism, imposed financial complex relations and global production change that altogether constructed the export-led model. In this period, especially in the 1990s, we got the great moderation along with increased inequalities and big technological gaps. In our account, developing and emerging economies had different performance in this period. Latin America had much poorer results in comparison to Southeast Asia. Here, I want to discuss the limitation of the export-led model and determine the region's possible economic alternative. I want to argue that Latin American poor performance is due to the augmented profit extraction by foreign capitals, reduced salary income and rising, and I put very much stress on the rising weakness of domestic institutions. Foreign investment inflows to the region have not strengthened financial markets. And the main problem is that the export-led model did have not reached current account deficit. Our account is that the export-led model continued to rest on foreign capital dominance, and Latin America remained, its dominant class retained the conservative and rentier position of the previous period. This inhibits the domestic ruling class to lead to a progressive insertion in the international arena. In this context, we want to discuss some basic concepts of the neoliberal model. I only want to say here that the main issue in this period has been to reduce the power of the states, leading Berlin discussion, and it's based on competition, the Pareto efficiency, rational expectation, market completeness, government interfaces are necessary in this context, and transactions are reversible, therefore no exchange costs, no free riders, and utility maximization dominates, there is no uncertainty. The main proposer of this model know that these assumptions are not right. Here I put a quote of Friedman that the realism of the hypothesis doesn't matter, provided that the model work on the basis of this hypothesis. Predicts empirical outcomes. So they don't care whether the assumptions are right or no, and market gap can be improved by macro foundation. So I think has been said here, crises are related to external shocks generated by erroneous economic policy and not to be confronted with further deregulation and more privatization. In this context, I want to discuss that deregulation, the main structural changes, and I want to argue that the main structural changes are deregulation combined with globalization. And here there is a power transference from the state to big corporations. And the state regulation is very limited, has been said. And in the financial sector, globalization reduced the space of financing policy, and global power was enhanced because international currency access took place through private domestic debt convertibility, something that has been discussed by ECLAC in terms of banks and bond market interconnectivity. I'm not going to go into that. There's a good discussion. And foreign investment became the main financing mechanism, which, as has been said by Pablo, is highly unstable. Another important issue is that market organizations were weakened to attain price stability, and fiscal policy were demonized. And there was no policies, there is very few policy instruments to ignite economic growth. In this context, globalization in Latin America is based on comparative advantage theory, and South America returned to raw materials, the so-called primarization. Central America, especially Mexico, specialized in assembled manufacture, taking place a deep disindustrialization. Government interference and regulation are considered to affect negatively economic growth, so they don't use it. The pillars of globalization and internalization are the principle of maximizing shareholder values. I'm not going very much in this definition because everyone knows it, and I only want to say that this has been led to some practices of overcapitalization. But in Latin America, this took place through foreign institutions because the capital market is very weak. In this context, we will argue that it increased Latin America dependence. In terms of the global production changes, I only want to argue that this led to unequal productivities and increased productive gaps. I think that Latin America has had the worst part in reference to Southeast Asia because it continued to have structural current account deficit, higher foreign dependence, limited space for government intervention, low public spending, limited technological advances, and again dominated by entrepreneurial classes, which are rentiers. And our main comparative advantages are low productive cost. This was coupled with income concentration. Latin America in this context has two big disadvantages. Its insertion to global production shares was static and subordinated to big capital interests, and the financial system remained extremely shallow, and big corporations, being multinational multilatinas, don't operate through the domestic financial system. Disadvantages are linked to what happened actually in the easy period, the unfinished easy process, lack of technological advantages, foreign control of dynamic productive sector, and high salary basket. Landlords didn't revolutionize their production organization. In this context, the Latin American easy process was based on reduced capital market and the exclusion of popular classes with higher current account disequilibrium, high income, and wealth concentration. Latin American economic groups never consolidated, and the financial bank-based system was subsidized so as imports. This condition, I will argue, that passed to the export-led model. In this context, Latin America specialized, foreign investment continued to control dynamic sector, and the financial system remained feeble. And the alliance between domestic financial capital and rentiers with foreign capital interest limited the attempts to escalate the domestic capital inputs in total production. What are the facts of this issue? Here we see commercial openness. Chile is the more open country of Latin America, followed by Mexico, and then we have Argentina, Brazil, Peru, sorry, and Colombia. Here is the commercial openness here. The current account, as you can see, on average has been negative, almost in all countries and in all periods, with the exclusion of Chile in these two periods, but in general, it is negative. And then I went to see what's the relation of investment and export intensiveness, and this is quite impressive. The relation of investment and export in Chile is below 1, so they don't need a lot of investment. The same in Mexico, although they specialize in different periods. We see that in Brazil, there is a different situation. There is not, investment is over export. And also in Argentina, funnily enough, it's improving in the second decade of the 21st century, which I don't have an understanding. Perhaps Pablo can explain more. Here we see financial openness is very old. As we imagine, Latin America is very old. These 6 countries are very open, especially this is the case of Chile, Mexico, and funnily enough, Peru is its financial openness is very high. Not so much for Colombia and Brazil, and Argentina has a very a changing behavior because of all the political changes that have taken place there. Here I went to see the financial accounts. The firstly, I look at it in net terms, and we see that Mexico and Peru has the widest difference between liability and assets. And if we see it in terms of, we see that foreign direct investment, has an important participation, and less so foreign portfolio investment, and other investment which are credits are actually non-existent. Here I look at it in terms of liability and assets. And here we found, for instance, that in the case of Chile has the highest liabilities, followed strangely enough for a small economy like Peru, Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico. If the assets are highest in Chile, Colombia, and Mexico, and Peru, Brazil almost doesn't export capital, which was quite a surprise for me because it has big multinationals. If foreign portfolio investments are headed by Chile, and in a first, second place, followed by Colombia, Peru, and Mexico. So we have it's quite different between these countries. Looking at that, I went to see capital markets, and what we found is quite a few small markets, reduced turnover, and very limited listed firms. Here we have Argentina, which is market capitalization relative to GDP quite small. The smallest, actually. The highest is Chile, and then Brazil, and I was astonished to see that Peru is higher even than Mexico. The turnover is relatively low in Latin America, and also we can see that listed firms are, in some cases like Mexico, declining. Peru, actually, they're increasing, but in general terms, we can see that the financial market is quite, or the stock market is quite shallow, despite the big entrance of external capital. What's impressive is the bond market. Here it's terms of the percentage of GDP. And we found that non-financial corporations has had a big increase in bond issuance. This is the case for Argentina, Chile, and and Brazil. It started in the early 2000s. It continued in the 2005 and 2009, and see the very important increase in after the global financial crisis, which continued in the last 5 years of the last decade. So what we can see that non-financial corporation and some financial corporation, like foreign, prefer to issue bonds in the foreign market, and actually these issuance, these bond issuance is increasing these countries' debt. We can, from this, we can see that the Latin American neoliberal version was extreme, strong deregulation with an extremely fast and deep globalization with reduced government intervention, individual freedom displaced welfare economy policy, and here we have some financial innovation, but it didn't go through domestic institutions. In this context, we argue that Latin America had a bad experience in relation to Latin America. What will happen in the 21st? What happened in terms of the 21st century crisis? The 2008 global financial crisis, I think, showed the limit of financialization and internalization, and they managed to restore capital market returns to non-conventional monetary policy, but it didn't make a lot of effect in the real sector. It didn't ignite, as it was said before in this table. Moreover, developed countries exported capital flow to emerging countries to raise financial returns. In this sense, liquidity in Latin America really went up as a result of non-conventional policy. We also can see discontent of the neoliberal ideology. In developed countries, I think Brexit movement and Trump winning the US president is part of that movement. And they also think, that we can see that in 2018, the first, we started to find some signs of a financial crisis. Latin America, good performance after the 2008 crisis was reversed, as it was said in December 2013 by the tapering program, especially in the primarized economy, because price commodity reduced. And there is in Latin America a social discontent with Mexico, López Obrador winning in Mexico, then the Chilean revolt, the Argentina, Fernandez winning Argentina presidents. We have the same Peru, Bolivia, Chile, Petro in Colombia, and hopefully in Brazil late in the year. The other crisis, SARS-CoV-2 made evident that globalization doesn't operate in periods of crisis. We can see that the lockdown effect, vaccine distribution, that showed big inequality among regional countries. As a result of the different lockdown waves, and more importantly, the hegemonic conflict between the West, headed by the US with China, restructured global production chains along with inflationary pressures that increased as a result of the European war. I think this was discussed in the previous, at the beginning of this seminar. What are the results? Inflation and economic recovery slowing down. Developed economy imposed restrictive policy through interest rate, and this is having a problem that is limiting economic recovery. What to do? I think one of the priorities of Latin America need to be that they require to attain autonomy in food, energy, and it showed that it's very important in the sanitary sector. And this requires regional alliances, like in Latin America, in Cuba has the sanitary know-how, Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela, the oil. Food autonomy requires big negotiation in the region. They started in Central America to make some negotiations for goods to be passed with no taxes. The other big issue that productivity needs to increase in order that wage to be raised. Negotiations here is important to negotiate with multinationals to oblige them to make a technology transference and link small and medium enterprise with the global productive chain. This, I think, can be attained in terms of Central America till Colombia in the context of the restructuring that's taking place as a result of the fight that the US has with China. The other thing that looks very important, that raw material export need to be stopped. In this context, Mexico's oil experience is quite interesting, and Bolivia lithium's experience need to be analyzed. Chile and Peru need to manufacture the raw materials and stop subsidizing transnational. I think there was a big discussion now when they draw the new constitution. And financial development institutions need to be strengthened. I think there is a big issue that big corporations need to operate through domestic market, create finance in domestic currency, and limit foreign domestic issuance. We argue that, and with this I finish, we argue that today these changes are easier in the context of the increased pinkration of the region. Here we can see that all the pink, and hopefully Brazil also, is sort of coloring Latin America and the Caribbean map, and perhaps some changes can be done to reverse the openness and the globalization in terms to regionalize more economic production. There has been some experience, and this is the only bet that we have. I don't think any country can do it itself. We have seen that Cuba and Nicaragua and Venezuela have not been able to surpass, but if Latin America can make a political alliance, perhaps things are different. Thank you very much.